Welcome everyone to this 13th anniversary of the founding of the Dave Ruggles Center. My name is Linda Ziegenbein, and it is my honor to moderate tonight's session. Now, I remember the first time I heard of what is now the David Ruggles Center. I was completing my doctoral dissertation on David Ruggles, and Steve Streimer, who will speak later tonight and who served as an invaluable resource for my research, told me that there was a house in Florence that had been granted a demolition delay. He told me he wanted to preserve it and to use it to create a local museum that would document our area's local involvement in the Underground Railroad movement and the early history of our village. I agreed to serve on the steering committee, but I'll admit that I was completely skeptical. I wasn't sure how we'd pull it together. I wasn't sure how we'd be able to pull together the resources, how we'd be able to get people involved, we'd be able to get funding or even really interest in this. And 13 years later, look at how incredibly wrong I was. The first meeting I attended was at the Florence Civic Center because we actually didn't even have a Ruggles Center then. And I remember that I was pregnant at the time and that the young girl that I was pregnant with is now almost 13. It was summer, or at least it was warm enough that I could wear a short sleeve shirt. I remember that sitting around the table at the Florence Civic Center was Faith Deering, Steve, Lisa Baskin, Craig Della Penna, Trista Metcalf, Emma Khan Sudan, and David Rosenberger. And we decided that we were going to name this house after David Ruggles, who was our local firebrand, doctor, abolitionist, and member of Florence's very small Black community. It was a very worthy designation, but what we didn't anticipate then was that it would mean that we would spend the next 13 years telling people that no, this was actually not David Ruggles' house. It was actually just named after him. And the things I remember about that first meeting, I remember our interest and our commitment to preserving our local history. I remember our shared commitment to social justice and its historical roots in our community. And I remember our shared desire to educate the public about this remarkable village and its residents. So here we are 13 years after that original conversation to celebrate what was started so very many years ago and to talk about where we go from here. Now, before we do that, we want to acknowledge the David Ruggles Center is located on stolen Nonotuck land. We want to acknowledge the history of colonialism and the genocide of Indigenous peoples that enabled the settlement of Northampton and Florence. We'd also like to acknowledge our neighboring Indigenous nations, the Nipmuc and the Wampanoag to the east, the Mohegan and the Pequot to the south, the Mohican to the west, and the Abenaki to the north. We thank them for their stewardship and faithful stewardship of this land that enabled the Ruggles Center to continue. So tonight, we'll have 3 talks that will focus on different aspects of research that is of interest to the Ruggles Center. Steve Streimer will first talk about the creation of the Florence Abolition and Reform National Historic District. Tom Goldschneider after that will talk about David Ruggles, who famously helped hundreds of enslaved New Yorkers, including Frederick Douglass, find their way to freedom. Ruggles moved to Florence and opened and established a water cure hospital here. Usman Power Green will be the final speaker, and he'll examine the reassertion of white supremacy in our communities. After the talks, I'm sure there will be many things that you want to discuss. We encourage you to make good use of the chat. After the three men speak, we'll have some time for a Q&A session. And then after that, Usman and I will have a conversation about where we go from here. What are the next steps? What are the things that we need to be thinking about to continue the important work done by those abolitionists so many years ago, right? But before we start that, we have 2 very special guests. First, we have Jo Comerford, who is here. She is the state senator of Hampshire, Franklin, and Worcester districts, and she is going to give a citation. Senator Comerford.
Thank you so much. I'm really very, very grateful to be with you. Thank you for allowing me and the Senate to celebrate the profound and lasting work of the David Ruggles Center as part of this Founders Day celebration. The principles of the Northampton Association were and remain revolutionary. Abolition, women's rights, workers' justice, all wrapped in a progressive vision of what's necessary, what's possible. Serving in the Senate, now for my second term, I'm acutely aware of the legacy of the diverse founders of our region as it's embodied in the profoundly effective advocacy of this community, our wider community. I'm deeply grateful to the Ruggles Center for keeping this history alive as a reminder of the shoulders on whom we stand and the generations of people who have come before us in the fight for justice. Amid a constant assault of racism and xenophobia, misogyny, and more, we need this beacon. Without the painstaking preservation embodied in the work of the Ruggles Center and its staff, volunteers, community, this priceless history, this bedrock would be lost. So the Senate President joins me in offering a Senate citation, and I won't read the entire thing, but please let me say that it's in recognition of preservation and of the Ruggles Center work in preserving, interpreting, and sharing the abolitionist and African-American history of early Florence. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Senator Comerford. We are honored to be recognized for our efforts. Thank you for your ongoing support and assistance in connecting us with friends and opportunities throughout the state. We are so grateful that you are one of us.
I'm grateful to be here. Thank you so much for your work.
Thank you. And now we'd like to welcome Representative Lindsay Sabadosa, who represents the 1st Hampshire District, which includes Florence, where the David Ruggles Center is located. Representative Sabadosa will give us a citation in support of the efforts put forth by the David Ruggles Center.
Thank you so much. I'm so delighted to be here this evening. I wanted to share very briefly that a few weeks ago, I was able to go to the David Ruggles Center with Tara and Tom, who were on the call. And as happens, we gain inspiration in places where we least expect it. And I wasn't expecting that day to gain inspiration. But little did Tom and Tara know that I was running to that visit in between trying to write an address for a conference that I was speaking at that weekend. And that conference was for Girls Up. It's an organization that inspires young women to be involved in advocacy and politics across the state. And Tom talked to me about how students go to the David Ruggles Center and the lessons that they learn there. And he started to talk to me about the pictures on the walls. And he said, remember, these people were not popular. The things that they did were not popular. They were not beloved. They were vilified, and they were hated often for their radical ideas being that people deserved equality. So I took Tom's words and I went to that conference and I brought that message to those girls about bravery, about doing not what is easy, but what is right, about how standing up and being unpopular is sometimes the best thing that you can do. That was the gift that David Ruggles Center has given me most recently. And I think that it's a gift that we were able to share with lots and lots of little girls across the state, for which I'm very grateful. So this evening, I'm delighted to present a citation from the Massachusetts House of Representatives. And of course, it is to the David Ruggles Center for History and Education, in recognition of their mission of carrying on the tradition of a radical abolitionist utopian community so that we may all continue to strive to do better. Thank you so much for having me here this evening and for all of the good work that you do.
Thank you, Representative Sabadosa. Thank you for your assistance to us on our very own road to truth and education. We consider ourselves very fortunate to call you a friend and supporter of our efforts. So whether we are giving walking tours, we're lending our knowledge to educational pursuits, we're teaching children in classroom settings, we're repairing local cemeteries, putting Florence on nationally acknowledged historical sites, we are sustaining this important work through your donations. We thank you all for your continued support. Truly, none of this work over the last 13 years could have been done without the support, the faithful support of people like you. So if you feel free to move, if you feel so moved, please feel free to give us a donation. That will drop a link in the chat. And this will allow us to continue the important work that we do and to share our work with others who might join with us in illuminating the historical truths that we focus on. So thank you. Thank you both, Joe Comerford and Lindsay Sabadosa, Senator Comerford and Representative Sabadosa for being here. And next we're going to transition to our talks. First, we'll have Steve Strymer, who is one of the co-founders of the David Ruggles Center and is the chief researcher. He's going to be presenting his talk entitled The Lay of the Land, Establishing the Florence Abolition and Reform National Historic District. And again, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. Thank you, Steve.
Hello, everybody. Glad to be here. Let me get my share going. All right, here we go. I want to start by giving some background on how the Florence Abolition and Reform National Historic District came into focus. In 2002, workers and volunteers at well-known historic sites and museums formed the Massachusetts Underground Railroad Network. Minuteman, Blackstone Valley, Essex National, Heritage Area, and Boston African American were all represented, and along with a few of us from Western Massachusetts, would meet quarterly to go over how best to interpret the Underground Railroad in our state. The New Bedford Whaling National Historic Park and the Nathan and Polly Johnson House in New Bedford spearheaded the effort. Catherine Grover was their lead historian, and her book, The Fugitives Gibraltar, published in 2001 by UMass, remains among the best ever written on the Underground Railroad. A regular attendant at the meetings was Betsy Freeberg from the Massachusetts Historical Commission, who was in charge of applications from Massachusetts to the National Register. The MHC hired Grover to write a context study for the Underground Railroad statewide to be used by town and city historical commissions. To go along with the context statement, the MHC had Grover and her partner, architectural historian Neil Larson, choose one Massachusetts house to write up for the National Register as representative of the Underground Railroad in Massachusetts. After visiting sites in towns across the state, they settled on 191 Nonotuck Street in Florence. The house built by the formerly enslaved citizen Basil Dorsey and later owned by the Reverend Thomas H. Jones. Shown here, here's his, I made my little pointer bigger. Here's Jones in the 1854 map. And here is a picture of him. He had been enslaved in Wilmington, North Carolina, and later settled in New Bedford by 1859. Interest in Florence abolition era history continued at the MHC, which again hired Grover and Larson to write up 123 Meadow Street, locally known as the Ross Homestead, for the National Register as well. The requirements of the National Park Service for register nominations have become more rigorous over the years, to the point that professional help is often needed to secure acceptance. The MHC footed the bill for these nominations, and with historians of Grover and Larson's caliber to boot. In Florence, we continued to make new discoveries of 19th century African-American houses and those of forgotten white abolitionists. After Sojourner Truth's house and Elisha and Eliza Hammond's house were identified, in 2001, the homes of David Ruggles, Basil Dorsey, Charles Burley, James and Octavia Damon Atkins, Henry Anthony were rediscovered in 2002. George W. Benson, Cynthia Dorsey, and Laura Knowles Washington in 2003, and Joseph Wilson, Ezekiel Cooper, and Lydia Mariah Child in 2004, with this house she rented found inside the Victorian built up around it at 27 Meadow Street. More recent discoveries included the homes of Alfred Critchlow, Hannah Randall, and our team of Tris Metcalf and Chris Thompson advised the owner on how to renovate this house, which was going to be torn down. We're very proud of them for the work they did on that house. And Anna Garland Spencer. A number of the houses had been moved from their original locations or had been extensively modified, likely disqualifying them for standalone register nominations. Houses of national interest like Sojourner Truth's house at 35 Park Street and David Ruggles' house at 47 Florence Road are in this category. Having a National Historic District dedicated to preserving these homes and surrounding landscapes will reveal the lives of their original owners and help us imagine them walking these streets, holding meetings, building businesses, raising families, living lives big and small. This seemed like the logical next step. In 2016, the Chinese Historical Society of New England partnered with the MHC to nominate the first site connected to the historic Chinese presence in Boston to the register. Grover and Larson wrote the application for the old Quincy School building and a context study about the history of Chinese immigration in Boston. Soon after its acceptance, we spoke to them about taking our district nomination, and they agreed. 2 years later, the David Ruggles Center, with the support of the Northampton Historical Commission, applied to the Community Preservation Committee of Northampton for the $30,000 it would take to do the wide-ranging project they envisioned. The funds were approved by a unanimous vote of City Council on April 17th, 2019. Now, we had imagined a compact, walkable district that would include these 1840 to 1860 houses and the landscapes that had been preserved as well. But we also wanted to include important later structures built after the Civil War, like the Hill Institute, Anna Garland Spencer's house that we saw before, and Elizabeth Powell Bond's house, with their stories of reform in education, free religion, and women's rights. Catherine Grover felt that framing a wider story of African Americans, abolition, and reform in Northampton as a whole would provide a context for the progressive industrial village that grew up in Florence. The work is largely done now, with Grover having completed drafts of her 2 narratives and Larson defining the district and buildings to be listed. Here's the district as it's laid out there. One of the great things, here's my arrow if you can see it, is these Grow Food Northampton fields, which was the original agricultural department of the Northampton Association. And then also this Park Street Cemetery and Mains Field, which was the utopian paradise. It was where they described it as paradise, where they would go out, where Frederick Douglass played bat ball with the Hutchinson family singers in 1844. So all these landscapes and the pine grove behind the Florence Congregational Church are part of this district. I'd like to read now from Catherine Grover's introduction to the district nomination, so you can get a sense of the caliber of her work, I would guess, and also a sense of what she's about here. The village's deepest significance rests in the Northampton Association of Education and Industry, an intentional community founded in the same year as such other utopian or model communities in Massachusetts as Brook Farm in West Roxbury and Hopedale in Milford. 2 years later, the short-lived Fruitlands community was initiated in Harvard. The 4 were among 59 such communities established in the United States between 1840 and 1849, all attempting to promote the great cause of social reorganization, to sweep from our earth repugnant industry, the tyranny of capital and chattel slavery, as well as to elevate woman to her true position in society, equalize the distribution of economic and social rewards, and perfect public education. Hopedale lasted longer, and Brook Farm and Fruitlands, largely through its founder, Bronson Alcott, are better known. But among these intentional settlements of like-minded people, only the Northampton Association committed itself overtly to racial and gender equity. It thus became one of the few village-level havens for people of African descent in Massachusetts. In 1850, at least 56 African Americans lived in Florence, which was then home to 580 people. At nearly 10% of the 1850 village population, African Americans made up a greater share of total population in Florence than they did in virtually any other Massachusetts place. Fully 1/3 of all Massachusetts people of African descent lived in Boston or New Bedford, where they comprised 1.5 and 6.2% of the population, respectively. Most Massachusetts towns, whose population ranged near Florence's, had either no or 10 or fewer African Americans residents in 1850. At least 15 of 19 documented fugitives from slavery in Northampton lived in Florence. Florence's history also demonstrates how multifaceted antebellum reform was. Though abolitionism and racial equality were central to the association's mission, was also committed to free thought, free speech, and enlightened and never-ending education, and the far broader abolition of distinction of rights or rewards between the strong and the weak, the skillful and unskillful, the man and the woman, and the rich and the poor. Personal histories of men and women who joined the association demonstrate plainly that many, if not most, abolitionists were not single issue reformers. They aimed to cleanse the body, the mind, society, and humanity of the corruptions perceived to have beset them in the early industrial era. As Frederick Douglass later stated of the period, the air was full of isms: Grahamism, mesmerism, Fourierism, transcendentalism, communism, and abolitionism, nearly all of which found expression in Florence. I think I'm going to stop there. I wanted to bring up this one book that is like the Bible, as far as I'm concerned, for what we're studying. It's really what set me off on this path back in 1997 was when I really became aware of it. And it's the communitarian moment, the radical challenge of the Northampton Association. And I really recommended it to everyone. UMass Press picked up the copyright from Cornell, so it's now available in paperback. If any of this interests you, what you're hearing today, this is one of the best things possible to look into. So here's another little map of the district really quickly. Again, down here is the Grow Food Northampton farm, 160 acres, is almost the exact footprint of the agricultural department. Here's Locust Grove, where perhaps Sojourner Truth had the camp meeting that it's described in her narrative. Here's Park Street Cemetery, where many African-American burials and the abolitionists are buried. Here's the Pine Grove behind the Florence Congregational Church. And over here, we think is perhaps where Lydia Mariah Child and David Lee Child grew sugar beets as an alternative to slave-grown sugarcane. So there you go. This is how many sites we have. And it's really been a pleasure to be able to share it with you. Back to you, Linda.
Thank you very much, Steve. It is always impressive and intimidating, your encyclopedic knowledge of our local history. And Steve, your words remind me that anthropologist Keith Basso says that spaces are containers for memory. And it strikes me that one of the things that the Ruggles Center does is it works to make our local history personal history, so that people walking through the town view this abolitionist history as part of their own history. So thank you. It was a really interesting and illuminating talk. So next we're going to have Tom Goldscheider. Tom is a committee member of the David Ruggles Center and holds a master's degree in history from the University of Massachusetts. He is going to be reading, or he's going to be giving his paper entitled In Sickness and in Health, David Ruggles' Water Cure in Florence. Thanks, Tom.
Okay, are we on? Welcome. I'm speaking to you from the David Ruggles Center. The Ruggles Center is aptly named. He did remarkable work. His years were 1810 to 1849, and the bulk of his work was in New York City. He moved there as a 17-year-old, and he left in 1840 to move here. And I'm going to not be talking about his work in New York City. We have an exhibit here at the museum, which I hope people can come and visit. And I'll just say that he was recently named the founder of the Underground Railroad, and he assisted over 600 self-emancipated enslaved persons to freedom through his apartment in Lower Manhattan. But what I'm going to focus on tonight in my short talk is his journey of healing and his last 7 years in Florence, and what brought him here. And Lower Manhattan, where he was operating, was really a hunting ground. It was a community under siege. He was a thorn in the side of, he was a very high profile agitator. He was an activist. He was called the most active man in the city. And he accomplished a freakish amount in the short number of years that were given to him to work there. Work took a tremendous toll on him physically. At the age of 27, he complained of liver complaints and dyspepsia. This is the only image that we have of David Ruggles. This is 1838, 1 year later. Just prior to this, he had been thrown down 2 flights of stairs when he confronted a seaman who had abducted 3 African-American teenagers and sold them into slavery in the Deep South. This was just one of hundreds of such cases that he handled. While he was recovering from those injuries, he was brought up on charges, bogus charges, by Thomas Darg, and thrown in jail and held in an underground, damp prison full of common criminals. And they kept raising his bail because of who he was. He was ultimately bailed out by Lewis Tappan, born and raised in Northampton. But he suffered what he described as great mental anxiety. And as early as 1837, he said he felt compelled to retire from the city and take refuge in the country. Of his magazine, the first Black-owned magazine in American history, The Mirror of Liberty, he took out an ad looking for an active and intelligent boy who will serve as eyes to the blind and feet to the lame. He lost his eyesight. He was virtually blind, and he was suffering from severe intestinal problems. Okay. And he was directed to Northampton. If you look at the top of this, the National Anti-Slavery Standard was the first newspaper, national newspaper, edited by a woman, Lydia Maria Child, who had lived in Florence with her husband, David. And she most likely directed David Ruggles to come to Florence. He was this towering figure in the great metropolis, and he was suddenly in this very vulnerable and humbled position. He was Black, blind, and broke. He had run out of funds, and they said he was broken in body, but not in spirit. And he found a safe haven at the Northampton Association. It had been founded on April 8th, 1842, the date that we're celebrating today. He arrived in late November of the same year. and he called it his promising home for humanity. This is a poem on behalf of David Ruggles. I don't know how legible that is. This is a public letter that was from David Ruggles in William Lloyd Garrison's Liberator. And he describes how his symptoms persisted in spite of the fact that he had been taken in this very loving and very respectful community. He was the first Black member of the community. He soon became a leader in the community. He was taken in by a family that treated him as, and he was really flourishing, but his symptoms continued. Part of what he was recovering from were the allopathic treatments that he had been subjected to in New York City. Bled, leached, cuffed, plastered, blistered, salivated, dosed with arsenic, Dux vomica, iodine, and strychnine, and other poisonous drugs. He was blind, he suffered from severe indigestion, and his skin had become insensible to the prick of a pin or of extreme heat. So he was fed up with the allopathic cures, quote unquote, and he turned to a new cure, which had just been embraced by the abolitionist community and introduced to him also by David Child. And this was a cure called the water cure. And there was a Dr. Robert Wesselhoft from Germany who had settled in Cambridge, and he became the first practitioner in this country. And David Ruggles traveled to him and was diagnosed by Dr. Wesselhoft, who was not sanguine of success. But David Ruggles went back to Florence, and this is the most remarkable piece of the story. He was completely blind. He was absolutely at rope's end. This doctor, who was his last resort, said he was not holding out much hope. In spite of that, he had the people at the community construct a bathhouse for him, which is seen here in the article, constructing a bathhouse where I could obtain a douche from a spring of pure water. And for 18 months, he subjected himself to this water cure, following a correspondence course with this doctor. And he effectively healed himself until the point where his sight was partially restored and his whole system was attended with an unaccountable sensitiveness. Other people at the association were impressed enough that they agreed to let him administer the cure to them. Sojourner Truth was the first to step forward. She had lifelong illnesses. You know, if you know anything about her early life, it's not surprising that her body was screaming at her. Took the cure, she called it a humbug, and then said, I shall die if I continue in it, and I may as well die out of water as in it. But then after another week of almost giving up, she had a grand crisis, a humor exuding from her legs below the knees, coursing from her feet and the very ends of her toes. And she returned to work a few weeks later. She ran the laundry department at the association, and she lived well into her 80s, symptom-free. He cured her. Another case, Steve showed you a minute ago, the Austin Ross homestead. This is the 10-year-old son of Austin Ross, suffered from a congenital disorder, nausea, vertigo, inflammation of the bowels. He treated this 10-year-old child for 7 months, during which time he had a painful crisis, which commenced on down the legs to the feet and toes, which became inflamed and swollen to more than twice their ordinary size, the color of his feet changing alternately from a red to a purplish hue. They finally became suppurated, in which time they continued about 6 weeks, the humor exuding from the sides of his feet. Okay, so this is pretty hairy stuff. Hydropathy was developed in Germany by a Silesian farmer with no medical training. And just to describe it as briefly as possible, his greatest discovery was called the wet sheet, in German, the Leintuch. And this was typically a cold, wet linen cloth that was tightly wrapped from head to toe around the body of the patient for an hour or more, followed by cold and tepid baths, sitz baths, showers, etc. The idea was to cool the body. You weren't sweating, you were eliminating debris of accumulated toxins, such as eruptions on the skin. And this was followed drinking lots of cold water and lots of exercise. And the whole idea was to precipitate the crisis, which really things got worse before they got better. This was not a relaxing day at the day spa. This was an arduous procedure, an arduous experience that really required stamina, courage, self-discipline on the part of the patient. David Ruggles, ever the pioneer, doing things first. There's a lot of firsts associated with his career. Pioneered what he called the principle of cutaneous electricity, where he used his delicate sense of touch to feel through the surface of the skin of a healthy person a regular and forcible action or emission indicating vitality or power. In other words, he was able to use his sense of touch to diagnose and prescribe and to select patients. He turned away as many patients as he accepted. He had intended to re-enter the arena of anti-slavery, but instead he bought this small house where he was able to treat up to 6 patients at a time. And then by 1846, with help from Samuel Hill and from the Northampton Association, which sold him this land where the Elks Club is now, he built a 36 by 50 structure that could house 30 to 40 patients. This is the hospital that Linda referred to earlier, with separate parlors, bathing and dressing rooms for ladies and gentlemen. And he had everything from headaches to nervous stability to rheumatism. And he turned away as many patients as he accepted. And he advised practitioners of the water cure, water cure establishment to open in America, followed by several others in short order. There was a water cure craze. The guest list at his water cure read like a who's who of prominent abolitionists. William Lloyd Garrison complained of a pain in his side and chronic inflammation in 1847. Dr. Ruggles, as he was now called, pinned it to overexertion in speaking upon the public square, and he prescribed total abstinence from all anti-slavery meetings and suggested that he come and take the cure for a minimum of 6 weeks. The following summer, in July of 1848, Garrison arrived by train and submitted to the cure, and he wrote a series of letters, much to the consternation of the doctor, to his wife Helen, and those give us really our best descriptions of the experience of the cure. He described being woken up at 3 a.m. to the packers stirring about, preparatory to packing their patients. And he said he slept on a bed composed of straw. He found his bath refreshing, and he enjoyed a fine ramble in the countryside. I hope you're not seeing that. After his bathing, he said, "We are either in the woods or in the water." It was a beautiful setting where he was. So a big part of the cure, in addition to the water and the purification, was exercise, rest, and diet. I see that I'm running out of time, so I'm going to end with, unfortunately, a year later, his symptoms returned. He was unable to cure himself. And Ruggles himself died at his own water cure on December 16, 39, the same age that Martin Luther King and Malcolm X died. Frederick Douglass, one of the 600 that he rescued, said he has literally worn himself out in humanity's service, ever ready to do his might, whatever he could do for the benefit of the human race. So we are privileged that this giant of a man spent his last, if I could just read one more very short quote from Frederick Douglass. He at last became blind and needed others. Even in his blindness, he exhibited his manly character. When hope of his own health was gone, he had hope for others. So it's just a tremendous example of courage where, instead of, pitying himself, he instead became a healer. He healed himself and he healed. It's a pretty amazing story. So thanks for listening. And I'll turn it back to you, Linda.
Thank you very much, Tom. That was a great talk. And the story about David Ruggles and his health concerns always reminds me of the high cost of activism that we don't always pay attention to, because, as you said, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., and David Ruggles all died at the age of 39. And certainly they were owed and deserved another 50 years. And so the work that we all need to be doing is to make it so that we don't have people who have to burn themselves out. And they have also they live long lives, and what was it that they also get to comb the gray in their hairs. So we're going to finish these 3 talks out with Usman Powergreen's talk, It Can Happen Here, Resisting White Supremacy in Our Neo-Fascist Moment. So Dr. Powergreen is an associate professor of history at Cork University, and we are very welcome and very lucky to have him here tonight. Welcome.
Thank you for those exhilarating talks. I was writing my notes and thinking about how to weave together what was just said with my talk, but I got 15 minutes. I'm gonna start the timer, so that may not be possible. But for question and answer period, perhaps, Linda. So let me just go ahead and share my screen so we get started here. So first of all, again, thank you for inviting me to present. I have been spending a lot of time in the last year really thinking about the way in which our social movement history that we studied at the Ruggles Center, that we spend time with youth, abolitionists, 19th century, in this particular moment and how it connects. And so what I thought I would do is I would share with you a talk that I've been thinking a lot about as a part of a project that I'm working on that considers sort of the history of fascism and race and racism. And given the incidents that have happened recently, the work that I've been a part of with a group of scholars has felt even more urgent and pressing. And so that's what I'm gonna spend time with us, time speaking with us today. And so much of our work always has to do with this question of history and memory, right? Sort of the representation of the past that we study in the documents that we've gathered at the Ruggles Center, the historians look through, but also this question of how the general public thinks about the past, remembers the past, and sort of how our memory shapes our ideas about the history that's in places like Northampton, Florence, and all over the country. There has never been a time when questions of representation, memory, and history have been more relevant than now. And this really hits home here in their community. And so I want to get into how some of this long arc fits into the work that we do. I talk to youth, high school students, middle school students all the time. And I recently gave a talk at a conference that was of high school students who were sort of engaged in social movement, social activism. And it dawned on me that some of the classic works that think about racism and white supremacy over the last 20 years, particularly the one in the middle, American History X, is completely lost on our youth today. Some of them, are familiar with Black Klansman, obviously, it came out more recently. but some of the sort of classics that have given our general public, some sort of engagement with this history is just not known. So young people really, maybe they saw the Spike Lee poster, but in terms of thinking about the history of racism, the Ku Klux Klan, white supremacy, fascism, it really is not something that many of them spend that much time learning about formally, right? So formally in school. And so unfortunately, these are topics that we have to engage in because of our given moment, and particularly the last 3 months. Many people, most people, some people in here remember the first and most famous iteration of this goes back to, which is where I got my title from, goes back to the classic Sinclair Lewis, It Can't Happen Here. I was just reading and prepping for this talk, and not only did Sinclair Lewis sell 350,000 copies of this novel, but apparently in the last 3 months, Amazon has blown up with people buying copies of this classic novel, given the events at the Capitol that I want to get into, right? And so there is this interesting historic arc where you have the events, recent events, conjuring up fictional representation of events around fascism, and re-engaging, reinvigorating our sort of popular imagination. Sadly, the imagination that Sinclair Lewis brought up in his work was actually a part of history. We rarely, those of us who are history teachers and who are here, rarely talk about the American Bund, American First Committee, or Nazis in the United States, right? And so when people talk about fascism or films come out to try to deal with these topics, there really is no sense of what we think about as homegrown American fascism, right? Instead, it's either fictionalized with Sinclair Lewis, or it's sort of over there and the history is not engaged about us in the United States then and now. So the group of scholars, so I've been working with Bradley Hart. I'm fortunate enough to be in this edited collection with him. And so he presented his work from this book on Hitler's American Friends, which came out a few years ago, which really looks at this history and thinks about the sort of way in which, charting the actual history of, as I said, American First Committee, American Bund. So I've learned a tremendous amount from them. And my contribution has been on how Black American activists, particularly in the 60s and 70s, engaged in fascism, neo-fascism, the Klan, and framed it themselves as a part of this longer tradition of white supremacy that goes way back, as we mentioned, to the 30s. And so my article sort of looks at that. And so I want to sort of get into that and sort of talk about it a bit and bring it home to what we've been doing. Now, there are those who watch this moment of the insurrection at the Capitol and questioned a bit about, to what degree was, is Donald Trump either a fascist or does he support and promote fascism? There are those scholars that have for a long time said, no, you're exaggerating. There's not connections between, President Trump and anything, that per se, besides emblems here and there, but no. However, after the incidents, some scholars did for a long time, such as the most famous scholar on this topic, Robert Paxton, when he witnessed things such as this, right, and witnessed the events of this moment, came out and actually said, as the quote said, this is from Time Magazine, "I've hesitated to call Donald Trump a fascist till now," and the not classic, but the probably the more foremost scholar on fascism, Robert Paxton, now he's retired, but feels comfortable making this connection, right? Which some people scoffed at, as I said, and even he hesitated to do that until now. Now, for us living in New England, living in Massachusetts, the idea that somehow it's down there, Charlottesville's in Virginia, right? Yeah, church burnings, other sorts of expressions of white supremacy. Yeah, well, that's somewhere else. That's not here, right? However, some of us followed this in the news, but after this is in December, there were several attempts to burn a church the Martin Luther King Presbyterian Church in Springfield. And it actually was successful, not burned to the ground, but the third attempt was successful. Subsequently, the person, I haven't looked recently, but subsequently the person who was arrested by the FBI is actually a person from New Hampshire who is a white supremacist, right? And so the idea that, it's somewhere else is simply not true, right? Here in Massachusetts, Springfield, right? We have people preying on Black communities, on structures like churches, and expressing their white supremacist beliefs, right? Now, some others who are in the community here are familiar with the incident that happened more recently at the middle school, right? Where, somebody, was it a student, somebody else, who was responsible, posted this on Facebook and led sort of to a firestorm around, this sort of effort to utilize the symbols of white supremacy, which the Confederate flag absolutely is one, in order to, and this is a part of a sort of much larger conversation, but this website and the subsequent messages were in response to the new principal's message that was around the Confederate flag and people having it on their screens, right? And so in response to this, there was a tweet, there was a message that was put up on Facebook, something basically targeting specifically the principal, who's a Black principal, surrounding sort of his this tyrant was written in this suburb for him bringing up the Confederate flag and speaking to the broader community about the inappropriateness of having the Confederate flag as a backdrop, for example, on students, students who are on Zoom, basically, right? And other sort of incidents like Zoom bombs, or people come in and shout, at racial epithets, other sorts of things, as a way to intimidate. This sparked a rally and created tremendous attention, in the community by students, right? Some of the students have been to the Ruggles Center. Some of the students have been, have looked at sort of historically the way in which Northampton and Florence specifically has been a part of anti-racist work. And so they're sort of aware of the history and legacy of our community with regards to challenging racism. However, at the same time, as we've seen, this is not something of the past. This is something that's very much a part of our present. And our young people need to be educated about the ways in which, these symbols, what these symbols represent, basically, to engage in intelligent conversations about how inappropriate they are. The students who I spoke with, of course, are very much aware of this and were a part of organizing this rally that happened at the middle school after this incident, that demonstrated the sort of agency and activism that, of course, is a part of our history that people previously spoke about. Now, Angela Davis is one of the people, foremost speakers that take us and bridge the sort of gap, at least from the 60s, late 60s, 70s, definitely to present. Because Angela Davis has been a person who consistently over the years, even though people scoffed at it, right, has talked about fascist tendencies within American society, right? And so, on this, the Democracy Now! 2016, in this talk, she talked specifically after Trump was elected about the fact that the fascist tendencies beneath his campaigning and the people he surrounded create what she saw as a fascist threat. Now, this is 2016, right? By this year, 2021, but definitely by 2017, as we saw in Charlottesville, as mentioned, these fascist tendencies, right? These sort of idea that, that we're not far away from those really organizing and bringing back and, a sort of concerted resurgence of fascist tendencies and racism in American society really begin to kick off in earnest in terms of the popular mind with Charlottesville. Other rallies that happened, right? There's many, right? But Charlottesville is going to be the one, and the catalyst that I see, at least, as being, specific attention around this questions of the resurgence of organized fascist, racist organizing across the country. Now, part of what's missed, I think, in the conversation has to do with the sort of aggressive nature, this sort of conflict between, as I showed in the first slide, those who are either anti-fascist Antifa, right, anti-fascist organizers, those who consider themselves Black Lives Matter organizers, right, and the way in which the effort to challenge becomes a part of, as you can see in this encircling, the intimidation that's one click away from the sort of overt violence that has always been a part of fascism in the United States, be it Klan, be it neo-Nazis, right? Right there on the surface, not reported as much, right? The ways in which this engaged, even the fight. Some of us here, of course, are aware of the sort of attacks on people, the physical violence that took place in Charlottesville, even in train stations, for example, right? You know, of Black people just being attacked who were there, right? But some of this has sort of been missed, I think, in the popular media because instead it sort of has been focused around some of the flashpoints and some of the key figures. Now, Cornel West, you know, sort of been pushed out of mainstream media. It's another conversation. But he and others more recently, right after Charlottesville, attempted again, like Angela Davis and others, to show us and to point in the direction that of what's on the rise, right? Now, in the media, West was able to sort of talk about the ways in which this Antifa, and this, you know, sort of in one of his quotes, he talks about how Antifa saved him when he was at sort of Charlottesville at the rally, and the ways in which sort of the framing of those who fight against fascism, those who fight against white supremacy, are framed as taking liberties, right? Taking away people's liberties, or bringing in a world order of sort of anarchy or something negative, when ironically, you know, as we saw, right, the people who are bringing sort of what we think about as insurrection are, of course, not the figures who are fighting against it, but instead those who find themselves rallying around what President Trump said very specifically. Now, in my work, in my specific chapter in this collected volume with Bradley Hart and others, I tried to trace for people somewhat of a line between protests in the 60s by, you know, the most famous example has to do with the Black Panthers, but how they connect to the work of Black Lives Matter, right? So this effort to show this sort of long arc from the 60s to present. Very ambitious chapter. Linda said she read it. Maybe she did. It's very long, everybody. But what it attempts to do is bridge that gap, right? And it attempts to sketch out the arc between those who argued and made the claims of fascist tendencies from Angela Davis, the Black Panthers, and looking at that arc to the work of activists today. As I said, a very ambitious chapter, but I attempt to sort of sketch out not just, again, looking at the sort of fascism within, but anti-fascist activism, right? Anti-fascist Black activism. There is no time, in my view, except for now, for us to engage this history, right? To engage the history of anti-fascist organizing, to engage the history of Black Americans and whites who fought against fascists. There's my 15 minutes. I'm finishing up. There's been a time to engage and look at the history, right, of those that have very specifically challenged racism, fascism, neo-Nazis, et cetera, until now, right? And so it's my belief that we got to get in schools, we got to teach, you know, young people this history, right? We got to teach them first the history of white supremacy in America, fascism, Nazism in America, right? And we also have to teach them about figures, Davis, other organizations that attempted to directly confront those who attempt to spread hate, those who attempt to prey on middle school students by rallying them around notions of whiteness, or those who drive down from New Hampshire and burn Black churches. You know, we need to engage the history, we need to engage the present, if in my view, we're going to be able to be prepared and ready to protect our communities against these sort of insurgencies. So I will stop there and pass it back. Let me exit and stop sharing. And thank everyone for their attention.
Thank you, Usman. That was a great talk. I have some things for us to talk about when we have our shared conversation, but certainly there's a lot of good work that still remains to be done, and sort of the children and the youth today are an integral part of it. I also have to say, I heard your little aside about not believing that I read your article. I did. I read the whole thing. It's got post-it notes and everything. So, there were some questions. There was a specific question around about dealing with racism. And I think, Usman, I'm going to keep that conversation from Tom Weiner for when we talk. I do have a question for Tom and Steve. As you're talking about sort of the creation of this historical district, and you're talking about health, really what I keep thinking about is in some ways what you're talking about are sort of networks of care, right? And about how these friendships are formed, how these groups come together, and how they're able to support and sustain each other, right? I mean, you could say that David Ruggles, who was close to death when he came here, maybe that extra 7 years was gained by being, through the care that he received as a part of the Northampton Association. So I'm going to ask Tom and Steve, if you can talk more about the friendships that were formed and how those have played a role in sort of creating the Ruggles Center, but also the Northampton Association.
So you mean the friendships we're able to uncover between these people that we're studying and honoring?
Yeah.
To think about that. One of the buildings, here I am, a building guy, finding the Benson Cottage and looking who all was living there at that time. It wasn't just Sojourner Truth, where she was also, where she had probably begun her narrative. It was members of the Benson family that had come up, Anna Benson and others, and Olive Gilbert was probably staying there for a while. And we're thinking about it, and I know the men probably had kind of crustier friendships, but we like to talk about the Sisterhood of Reform. Our walking tour is dedicated, sort of named the Sisterhood of Reform that happened in Florence. It's the idea that of women's rights in Florence as being fundamental and almost unquestioned in Florence changed everything for people living there. Frances Judd became an active leader, not just at the Northampton Association, but later at the Free Congregational Society. Sarah Askin, an African-American from Pittsfield, presided at the large banquets they'd have at Cosmian Hall, this temple of free speech. So these were all, and they decided to live in a neighborhood. When they broke away from the sort of thoroughgoing communism of many people, 80 of them at once living in this factory, and realizing that wasn't going to hold together over time, they created what they called the neighborhood community. And they moved up the hill and founded up on Pine Park Street and up there and Maple Street, a different kind of community that was not as ambitious radically as they had pledged when they were younger, but letting Samuel Hill kind of run the show. They still forged friendships that were long lasting, almost to the person. They look back on these days as the fine, as kind of like I reminisce about the 60s sometimes. I mean, sometimes a little more than it merits, but I remember feeling that we were in kind of, a very special, almost apocalyptic kind of period, but holding each other there as friends. Take it away, Tom.
I would just briefly like to add that if anybody is in any way intrigued by this history, that they should read the letters of Dolly and Elmira Stetson to their husband and father, James, who was mostly in Boston. This is an amazing cache of letters that was discovered in an attic not that long ago by UMass. He was a traveling salesman, and the family was separated, and that's always a boon for historians. Think John and Abigail Adams. And it's just, I talked about it a little bit, that just incredibly dark time where David Ruggles was literally and figuratively operating in the dark. I mean, he was completely blind, and he was figuring out this cure and applying it to himself. And that whole time, he was taken in by this family of, farmers, and trades. He was a tradesman, and he was, it's just very touching to read that really ground level. They were in awe of him, first of all. I think a lot of people at the association were, just because he was really a rock star. But just the passages of how the daughters describe leading him around and reading to him, and he was shelling peas, and then he was advising them on real estate transactions. It's just that's a great place to go.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. And Peter Scherf, I think is how you pronounce your last name, has one question, and this is going to be the last one, and then I'm going to pivot to the conversation that Usman and I are going to have about sort of next steps. But his question was, how is Florence different from Northampton? Did abolition and Underground Railroad activities happen in the larger community of Northampton? It's an always interesting question. Yes. So I'll let you both. And I'm going to tell you that we're winding down, so there's a long and rich story there. And so I would say to keep an eye out for further events, but I'm going to ask, so Tom and Steve, for you to address it, but succinctly, perhaps.
Wow.
Yeah, good luck.
There's kind of a simple way to look at it. And Christopher Clark, in that book I mentioned, Communitarian Moment, points to this, that although we had African-American members of the association, and during the association time, there was demonstrated Underground Railroad activity, Northampton was actually more active, frankly, on the Underground Railroad than what were these folks in Florence. And largely, there were three major players up in the Underground Railroad: J.P. Williston, Erastus Hopkins, and Moses Breck. And they were a team that forwarded self-emancipated folks up to different places. And Williston took over the mill, the silk mill, and would hire and turned it into cotton manufacture, ironically enough, but hired folks there that made it known that they didn't want to go to Canada. They'd prefer to settle. So Northampton, there's no place quite like it for this split in abolition that happened in 1839-40. Where downtown Northampton was all Liberty Party, evangelical abolitionists, and then Florence were these radical Garrisonian abolitionists. So in answer to your question, yes, there was plenty of abolitionists, just not the kind we tend to favor. That's my take on it.
Okay.
Tom, did you?
I don't think I have much to add. It's too much to go into in a soundbite. Northampton, as Steve alluded to, presents a fascinating microcosm of the two sides in the split within the abolitionist movement. And I guess if you were to use a very, analogy to the 60s again, that Steve talked about, it was people that wanted to work within the system versus people who thought that the system was just so utterly corrupt that you had to pull yourself out and really model a whole new way. And that's what was happening in Florence. And the people downtown said, no, we're going to stay in the church. We're going to stay in the political process. We're going to try to heal from within, and pick your flavor. They were all honorable people.
Yes, good. Well, thank you. Thank you both, Tom and Steve. And I would encourage anybody who is thinking, I want to learn much more about this, to visit the David Ruggles Center website, to follow their upcoming events, and to stay apprised of what's happening. So Usman, we're up, my friend. And, you know, one of the things I have to tell you that there's a poignancy actually to us having this conversation at this historical moment. You know, in a time when there is increased awareness of racial violence, to have this closing conversation be between a Black man and a Chinese American woman is, there are a lot of different elements at play, I think, in this conversation. So, you know, my thoughts are very much, again, on, I'm going to use the same network of care, right? And how we expand, how do we take sort of the wisdom and the experience and also the lessons, right? I mean, the Northampton Association, they had a grand vision, but in some ways they fell short of that vision, right? And so how can we take the lessons that we learned then from studying them and apply them now, right? Because we're in this moment where, again, people are saying there are a confluence of things happening, that there's an awareness about racial violence and white supremacy and, you know, fascism. Like, everyone all of a sudden knows what fascism is. And certainly we know it's not democracy, right? It is and so Usman, my friend, what are your, you know, how do we extend this network of care? How do we sort of pull those lessons from the 1840s to today and then beyond?
Well, first I would say that that we, you know, first thing that went to my head, Linda, was like, we don't know this history. So that's the first problem, is that, you know, unfortunately, we don't know a lot of the history that we're teaching at the Ruggles Center about Northampton, about Florence. So I'm always stunned how few people are really aware of the history. I mean, it's great because that's what we do and we educate people about. So that's the first thing, is I do think we need to understand exactly it. But every single era has different challenges. So I mean, the sort of application of the challenges that Ruggles and others faced in the 1830s was you know, is very linked to that moment. But I think the lessons we bring from it are finding a point of unity and going with it. I mean, the lessons of split are usually around tactics, right, or ideology. It can be either one. What concerns me is that we are consistently reactive, and we're consistently sort of responding, instead of saying, like, all right, you know, how do we look at the DNA of our community, Northampton and Springfield and Massachusetts and the United States, and how do we, you know, go specifically toward those people that try to hide behind, you know, rhetoric and other sorts of things, and engage them and force them to sort of come out of their holes and show that we, you know, that we have a community of care too, you know, that we're not just waiting for Black people, you know, Chinese Americans to step up, that we're going to step up individually, irregardless of that. And so, you know, those are some of my response and thoughts on how we take that and use it now.
Yeah, so countering sort of the visibility, the heightened visibility. I mean, because I think that is, you know, one of the things that you say in your article that, again, I did read, right, which is that you reference the Green Day concert where they stop and they say, no Trump, no USA, no US KKK or something, but and people said, oh, it took the ascendancy of Donald Trump to really make people realize how entrenched white supremacy and where this is. And you make the very salient point that says, no, like it's who you're asking, right? This is really about what white privilege looks like, which is the option to not pay attention to these things. But if you looked at people like Angela Davis, if you looked at people who Black activists who've been saying for decades, no, this is something we need to pay attention to. This is going to happen, right? So, like, who are the people we should be listening to now, Usman?
Well, first, I mean, you know, my student just wrote that in this essay, and I'll say, you know, I'm always leery of the sort of like looking upwards, right? And that's something that I think the Ruggles Center, you know, sort of, you know, David Ruggles, you know, the folk at the center, you know, sort of, you know, we all ourselves as a community have people here who've been engaged in this work, you know, as activists, as intellectual activists, right? And so I'm much more interested in sort of community people, particularly people of color, particularly women who have consistently been doing the work, right? And so so my answer is look around us. There are some of them on this call, in Northampton, in our community in Massachusetts, who are literally doing the work. The thing is, and this is, part of we can get into the history of the Ruggles, sort of like of David Ruggles and sort of the Northampton Association, but we're usually have our head down doing the work. So we're not standing up on a pole shouting like, hey, everybody, come like do work with us, right? And sometimes that can be to our detriment. Sometimes we got to pick our head up, shout it out, like, come on over. And as opposed to just having the view, which many activists do, which is I lead by example, right? I just do my thing. That's okay. But when white supremacists are preying on our youth in our middle school, some of us need to pick our heads up and make sure we're getting out and we're educating people and showing them we're not going to take it.
Yeah, and I think in making that connection, right, to say the David Ruggles Center, we're looking at this period of almost 80 years ago, right? But really, it's because of what it tells us about today. And this, I'm going to pull in Tom Weiner's comment, and he brought it in again. The history of African Americans and who's researching to find out why there are so few Black people living here. And what I would say, Tom, is that one of the things that that really struck me is, after the passage of the Second Fugitive Slave Act, that there was this great letter that was published in the local newspaper where basically the Black residents of Northampton said, we are your colleagues, like we are your neighbors, and you should protect us. But the sad truth, and that is incredibly great, but the sad truth is then when you look at the census, the number falls down since after that point, right? And so it's about, and I think that is an interesting question. And maybe Steve or Tom, if you know, or Usman, if you know, if anyone is picking that up to say what happened. I mean, there are problems with the census. It could be that people just didn't want to be enumerated. One of the things that I think about, and Usman, I'm going to pull this to you, and Steve or Tom, I guess just raise your hand if you can answer that question. But it's that, that the past is much more multiracial than we think it was, right? Than we give it credit for being, and it was much more diverse, right? And so when we think of the past, it's important to think about it as a place where there was a greater diversity of people than we would imagine. So Steve, I saw you had your hand up. Did you have a? No. Oh no. Oh, okay. He's saying no. He doesn't.
Well,
he doesn't.
I want to bring in though, Lynn, if you brought this up, I mean, when I gave a talk to high school teachers this summer, and I pointed out, I mean, y'all got to remember that 1992 is a long time ago. That was like 30 years ago, everybody. Like, and so the efforts that people on this, who were in the Zoom meeting did to get the statue, the year to end racism, right? That was a long time ago for young people. So that recent history is something to be charted and look at the intersection between the universities, since then, and this, from 1945 to present, when you look at NAACP in this region has been active with efforts to integrate. And so Tom, I'm not sure I got a PhD student who's looking at Black activists in Springfield and New England. And he's still doing work on his dissertation, but there has been works that look at the region. But your question is specific about Northampton and Florence. I'm not 100% sure who that is, but Amilcar might, and Bracy, I'm sure Bracy.
Yeah, and I think this is where we're looking at sort of the intersection of race and class. And as Northampton has become a wealthier community, then it becomes harder and harder for people who are of modest means to live here, right? And then the question is, so where do they go, right? Are they staying in this area, or are they leaving completely? Are they going to Springfield and Holyoke, or in East Hampton, or are they just completely leaving somewhere else?
Well, I mean, Springfield is more segregated than it was, in 2000,
yes.
Right? And so, segregationist countries increased. And so therefore, a lot of these things are playing themselves out that way too.
Yeah, no, yes, that's right. So Usman, I'm looking, we only have 5 minutes left. So is there any last minute things? I mean, I feel like there are so many things that we need to talk about. I think we need to take to the streets, right? This is the activist Linda coming out, but I think it's also, we need to teach our youth. I mean, and certainly we don't even need to go that far. I mean, truly, we can say January 6th, right? 4 months ago, let's look at what happened in our country 4 months ago. And, even just that one picture that you showed of the person with the Confederate flag in the Capitol, right? There's a whole curriculum that could be built around just that image.
And part of the last, I had like 2 more slides, but I mean, the last one I was going to say just has to do with the flag being banned in Northampton schools. So, I remember when I got off, I was on a call, people had told me like, hey, there's a big movement among the school committee to have the Confederate flag banned, right? And so there is those sort of efforts, but to me, that is like important for the self-care and the mental health of students of color to have that. So I think it's crucial. At the same time, we know that just because you ban things, that don't mean that the white supremacists aren't on video games. We didn't get to that talk about video game recruiting that's going on about white supremacists, the ways in which images are used. So there's so much more that we need to learn and do to preserve the mental health of our youth, to prevent our young white students from being prey to white supremacists under certain sort of seemingly innocuous messaging. And so we have a lot of work to do, Linda, in terms of educating. And this is where the David Ruggles Center comes in. I mean, you need to have self-sustaining organizations dedicated to history and anti-racist work. They need to be funded, and we need to use that as a resource. The teachers are working hard to try to teach these things, but as a former high school teacher, you may spend more time talking about Germany, for example, or World War II in the European theater, when you get that period, and not about, Nazis in the United States and, the American bund. And so there are structural ways in which some of the history, particularly of fascism and white supremacy, may not be a priority because of other desires. But at the same time, that's to our detriment, because our students really come away really having very little understanding of much of the way in which we have a consistent strand of efforts to make the entire nation reflect the ideas of white supremacists and Nazis and neo-Nazis.
Yeah, no, thank you. That is a powerful way to end this. So thank you, it was fun. So in closing, I want to say thank you everybody for coming and spending an hour and a half of your time with us tonight. I'm going to encourage you to visit our website to learn about our new interactive curriculum for visiting school groups. We want to share this important history, that some of which we've talked about tonight, with the next generation of learners. Our website also has self-guided walking tours on it. Because of COVID, we are not scheduling walking tours, but if you'd like to arrange one, you can contact us at info@davidrugglescenter.org and we'll schedule one for you. Similarly, we hope to schedule museum tours by appointments once there's a comprehensive vaccination schedule policy in place. And finally, we received a Mass Humanities grant to build out our online exhibits. So please check back and check periodically on our website for updates. So again, thank you very much. Thank you for your support of all of our efforts. And I hope you have a wonderful evening. Thank you to everybody.